I'll start by saying I'm going to date myself, and not in the romantic sense. Get your mind out of the gutter, Bumgardner. Do y'all remember the show Dallas? You know, way back in 1980, the big question on everyone's mind wasn't so much would Jimmy Carter win the presidential election. No, the big question on everybody's mind that year was, who shot JR? You remember? What was the identity of the shooter? It seemed the nation was captivated by establishing the identity of this one particular individual. And I gotta say that I was a little more than disappointed when Kristen, of all people, who was played by Bing Crosby's daughter, was revealed as the shooter. You want to talk about anticlimax. The premise of the very popular whodunit, Only Murders in the Building, is about establishing the identity of the individual who committed the crime. My wife, Diane, and I really have been enjoying getting into these British mystery detective shows. And of course, we do watch them with closed captioning because I can't understand their accents. Anyway, and I am convinced, absolutely convinced, maybe you've seen this show on PBS, Midsummer Murders. I'm absolutely convinced that there is no one left in Midsummer because they all been murdered by that little old lady. Identity is a big thing. It fascinates us. It mystifies us. It defines us. Identity is a big thing. Your sense of self refers to your perception of the collection of characteristics that define you. Personality traits, abilities, your likes and dislikes, your belief system, or your moral code, and the things that motivate you, all these things contribute to your self-image or your unique identity as a person. People who can easily describe these aspects of their identity typically have a fairly strong sense of who they are. But struggling to name a few of those characteristics might point one to a less defined sense of self. Now, you may not spend much time consciously thinking about your identity, but it still affects your life. Knowing who you are allows you to live with purpose and to develop satisfying relationships, and both of which contribute to your overall emotional and spiritual good health. Do I say yes to make others happy? What are my strengths? What brings me happiness? What are my values, and do I live according to those values? And do my choices reflect my own interests or someone else's? And do our identities change as we age and mature? Researchers tell us that identity is never final, and it continues to develop throughout our lifespan. I mean, that is to say that I don't think the same way. I don't really believe the same way or behave the same way as I did when I was 20 or 30. For example, I remember when I was serving here when it was then Calvary Church. I was a very young 31-year-old guy. Dan Moore was our organist at the time, and he and I were talking over by the side door of the educational building outside the office one Wednesday after choir practice. Now, at some point in the conversation, Dan says, "I want to show you something." I was like, "Okay." And he pulls out his wallet and he hands me a card. And I said, "What is this?" And he said, "It's my ACLU membership card." I was aghast. I didn't know what to think. I thought it would literally burn a hole in my hand. I mean, this liberal thing, is it contagious? Oh my word, what would happen to me if anyone saw me holding an ACLU card in my hand? I wish my 63-year-old self could talk to that 31-year-old idiot. God bless Dan Moore. God bless him. Sure, some of my beliefs are similar. But as a living, breathing, caring person, I've come to realize that my identity is evolving. Thank you, Jesus. Knowing that and accepting that gives me comfort and increases my own self-esteem and my self-awareness. Studies have shown that when people are doing what they think they should be doing, they're happy. Identity is important. And how we identify Jesus impacts the way we interact with one another and with the world around us. Jesus asked the disciples who others think he, the Son of Man, is. And we might consider viewing this question as an invitation to engage in critical dialogue with other perspectives. What do others say? The disciples answer, they say that, some people say that he's John the Baptist resurrected. Others say that he's Elijah, and still others claim that Jesus is Jeremiah or one of the other great prophets. In other words, Jesus, people don't agree. And isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting that people identify the Son of Man with long dead prophets that were sent by God, who did miraculous deeds, who stood toe-to-toe with kings and delivered them to them words of doom and opposition and even hope from Yahweh? So in the eyes of the people that these disciples were chatting with, John the Baptist was probably the last powerful man of God. But others had to reach all the way back to Jeremiah. And still, they were all dead men. I mean, did people actually believe that God could not outdo God's self? Did they believe, like Jesus, that no greater human being born had been born from a woman other than John? We read that in Matthew 11:11. What kind of human being is Jesus in the light of the many powerful deeds that he has performed and the many people who follow him? The people believe that Jesus is an incarnation or perhaps a specter or a ghost of powerful male prophets who no longer walk on the earth. It's Elijah and Moses that appear with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, and Peter, James, and John, they were there on the Mount of Transfiguration. So they knew that Jesus was not Elijah, nor was he Moses. And those who witnessed John the Baptist baptize Jesus in the Jordan knew that Jesus was not John the Baptist. So the disciples, by and large, are silent when Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" With the exception of Simon Peter. And Simon Peter is always the exception to the rule, seems like. With the exception of Simon Peter, the other 11 just don't seem to have an opinion of their own. And so Peter emerges as the spokesperson for the 12. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Let that sit with you for a minute. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. It's then that Jesus blesses Simon Bar-Jonah, presumably for the courageous student with the correct answer. Peter gets a gold star. Jesus states that Peter's answer did not come from human beings. It's not based on the rumor or hearsay of others, but it comes from somewhere else. You see, how we identify Jesus should be based on personal encounters with God, even though they may be informed by our readings and rereadings of the sacred texts and in and with dialogue with others. How we identify Jesus should be grounded in a lifelong conversation with God, whereby we adjust what we think we know as necessary. Our denomination, our church, our pastors, our mothers, our fathers, our siblings, our Sunday school teachers, and others will have their opinions. But in the end, we have to decide for ourselves in conversation with God how we will identify Jesus. For you see, a living God is a dynamic God. A living God is not a static God whose clearest communication happened in the dim, misty recesses of the past. Jesus is the Messiah of the living God. Jesus, as Son of Man, means that God continues to speak and to act. God does not have to resurrect John the Baptist. He doesn't need to bring Elijah back to life or Jeremiah or any other great prophet to speak, because God never ceases to exist. God never ceases to create. God never ceases to anoint. God can resurrect the dead for sure, but resurrection is never God's only option. Now, I am not a Greek scholar, although I did sleep at a Holiday Inn Express once at annual conference. Truthfully, I know just enough Greek to get into trouble, all right? But I saw something really interesting in this passage. As Jesus continues the dialogue with Peter, there's something kind of revealing that emerges in the original Greek. Jesus says this, "I say to you, Peter," and the Greek word for Peter is Petros, Petros, "that on this rock," Petra, hear the difference? "On this rock, Petra, I shall build my ecclesia," which means assembly, or is usually translated as church. "And the gates of Hades shall not overpower her." People. Pronouns matter. Greek, like Spanish, gives gender to nouns and verbs. So what we read here when he says, "I say to you, Petros, that on this Petra I shall build my ecclesia," there's a pairing here. The word Petra translated as rock is grammatically feminine, and it agrees with the Greek word ekklesia, which is also grammatically feminine. Thus, the noun Petra does not refer to Peter. Now, I may get in trouble with my Catholic friends over this, but you know what? I'm good with that. Perhaps Jesus is not building the church on Peter or even on Peter's proclamation. Maybe Jesus is speaking of the physical place or the space in which his identity was correctly named. Or perhaps it is the revelation itself that is the theological foundation on which Jesus will erect God's ecclesia. It will be an assembly founded on Jesus' identity as the Messiah of the living God. A God that is not static. A God that is active even today. For you see, a living God is a relevant God. A living God is a contextual God. As with John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, and the other prophets and prophetesses, God speaks a relevant word that reflects the context in which we live and the challenges that people face. A living God is not bound to or by the written page, even in a sacred text. Our living God reveals God's identity today through you. The other thing here is that Jesus says to Peter, I shall give you the keys of the kingdom of the heavens to you. And whatever you should imprison on the earth will be bound in the heavens, and whatever you should set free on earth will be released in the heavens. The heavens are witnesses of the people and the things that we imprison. The heavens are the witnesses. They witness the things and the people that we set free. When we restrict justice to the dominant and powerful and release or enact unjust laws that impact the most vulnerable among us and in the world, heaven knows, and it is impacted as well. Matthew's Jesus says that when you have treated the most vulnerable, the stranger, the foreigner, the imprisoned, those with no homes, the hungry, those without clean, affordable water, when you treat these people with compassion and justice and human care, and you've done so to me. What we do on earth matters, and it has an impact in the heavens and in the atmosphere around us. Oh, yeah. Identity matters. Identity matters. Finally, Jesus commands his disciples that they should tell no one that he is the Christos, the Messiah, or the anointed one of the living God. Don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. Well then, how will they build an ecclesia? How will they build an assembly? How will they build a community of faith on the truth of his identity one that even the gates of Hades will not overpower. How will that happen if they don't tell anyone? Maybe Jesus is thinking that their very lives would speak louder, that their very lives would speak more truthfully, that their very lives would speak more effectively than their words ever would. You know the old saying, always preach Christ, and sometimes use words. That's part of our identity, is it not? I heard something about your identity when Mark was sharing the announcements with all the outreach and ministries that you guys are about. It's part of our identity. See, the answer is how will anyone know? The answer is this, is by the life that they live. By a life of love for God, a life that loves the other as much as it loves oneself. A life that is in pursuit of justice and peace. Jesus says, on this rock thou shalt not build a prison nation. On this rock, Jesus says, thou shalt not build a nation where millions of children are homeless and hungry. Jesus said, on this rock, thou shalt not build churches that oppress the poor and women and turn a blind eye toward sexual violence within its gates and in the streets. Jesus said, on this rock thou shalt not build a nation that builds walls around itself just to keep people out. No. On this rock, let us build assemblies that demonstrate a belief in a living, speaking, incarnating God, a God of freedom and not of oppression, a God of justice, a God of love, and a God of peace. This, my friends, is our identity. This is who we are. Thanks be to God.